Hello again. Welcome to Q&A Live. I'm your host, Stephen Drunsic, and today I have a special guest with me, Jamie Hathaway, founder and president of Hathaway Communications. Jamie, welcome.
Hey,
thanks for coming on my show.
Thanks, Stephen. This is a lot of fun.
Back from my summer hiatus,
Yeah.
boy, the summer's just gone by, hasn't it?
It has.
You can almost smell fall in the air.
Well, I just dropped off my son today at Castleton, so I guess it's fall now.
It is fall now. You always see a couple of those trees that are, they seem to be the early ones to, and the brush on the side of the road starts to dry out, and within a few weeks you're going to start getting, eye in the sky is going to be calling for gardeners to cover up their crops. And
well, it's gone by too quickly, and this is nice. Thanks for having me here.
Well, yeah, it's you've got a very impressive resume. I know that you've been working for Orbis, but prior to that, you've probably had about 15 years working in one form or another on unexploded ordnance, and your work with ClearPath, obviously early on, and your continued work on finding a resolution to clear landmines from formerly war-torn areas. Yeah. So I'd love to get a little bit of your perspective on how you got into that.
Sure. Sure, it's a long story, but we've got a lot of time.
We sure do. It'll go quickly, though.
It will. It will. And thanks for letting me tell it. It all started actually back in 1996, 1997, which is really the birth of the landmine movement around the world. Princess Diana was still alive, and she was just starting to take up the issue of landmine survivors and landmine removal in Africa. And so when I got involved in the mid-90s, it really wasn't, it was an issue that was just coming to the fore. So I didn't know much about it myself. And I was working in a printing company at the time, and a gentleman came into, I was on the West Coast right outside of Seattle. And a gentleman came into our printing company, and he had a flyer called "Please Buy a Landmine." And it had a number of kids on the flyer, and one of them was holding what we believed to be a piece of unexploded ordnance, whether that was a landmine or some other thing that explodes or something. Right. I can't recall, but that's what started it all back in the mid-90s, and I was really taken by the issue. I was surprised that in Vietnam, and at the time this was 25 years after the end of the war in Vietnam when I found out about it, that there were still, on average, of a child or an adult a week being injured or killed by unexploded bombs. At the time, we thought it was all landmines. I think that was more of a translation issue when we were there. But we came to learn. I came to learn very quickly, and others did as well, that Vietnam has more of an unexploded bomb issue. So we got involved. I was with an organization at the time, a great organization that's still around, called Peace Treats Vietnam. My ex-wife and I were involved with them quite heavily, and we came back to Vermont to raise money to remove bombs from the ground in Vietnam. And that was my beginning to what I had no idea would be the next 20 years of my life.
Well, and I think obviously kudos to your efforts and all that are involved. It's interesting because you mentioned, at the time Vietnam, we had been 25 years past the final days of the war, and yet what we're talking about really are the after effects, the lingering effects of war. Right. And of course, this is not just an issue in Vietnam; it's an issue in all war-torn areas, all challenged areas throughout the world. And it's kind of the blind part of war and the lingering effects of war that we never see, or we never experience on a daily basis unless you actually travel and see the people that experience it, i.e., the people that they're maimed or killed out working, tending to their crops, and so obviously it's certainly important that we raise awareness on this issue
of the impact of war decades after war has ended. And I think we owe a lot to Princess Diana for that. I think in the mid-90s, people did not think post-conflict so much. I mean, there was no, for instance, there was no Marshall Plan for Vietnam. There was no rebuilding effort for Vietnam, and oftentimes there isn't for much poorer countries. And even in Europe, they're still finding bombs left over from World War II.
Yeah, I think I remember there's one story about some folks doing an excavation, or maybe it was for a road in the UK, and there's a picture of a German bomb. Of course, it was much larger
Yeah.
bomb than what we're talking about.
And they're still very dangerous.
Yeah.
That's why some of the best deminers in the world are from the UK. And I work with many of them. I mean, not many of the organizations, rather. Not many, there are EOD experts all over the world, but some of the best EOD teams and EOD groups are from the UK.
And of course, you've been all around the world to some of the most challenging environments. You've been to Vietnam, you've been to Laos, you've been to Afghanistan. I was, you've done you've had some write-ups on your blog, and I know that you're working on a book that discusses your experiences. If I can remember the name, The Missing Piece, My Personal Journey, Confronting the Explosive Deadly Legacy of War from Vietnam to Afghanistan. There's your plug. Yeah, right. Which means you also have to finish that book.
I have to finish it, right. I have to come up with the
it's
end.
It's out in the open.
Right,
but,
a happy ending. I'm trying to work on a happy ending.
Yeah, it's interesting. You give a teaser and you talk about some divers that...
yeah, I can tell that story.
Yeah,
it's
maybe you can tell that story.
And I was, like I said, I'm working on this book, and I went to school for journalism. That was I'm a communications guy, and I went to school to become a classic journalist. And I wanted to do things like go to distant places and shine a light on these sort of dark episodes of humanity and be able to tell those stories. I never imagined that I'd be actually in the story as I am now in addressing conflict or addressing post-conflict in the form of landmines and unexploded bombs. And but anyway, I started writing this book, and I wanted to look up some of the details about cluster bombs, and specifically about the manufacturers.
You might want to just give the audience a rundown on what a cluster bomb is.
Oh, sure, that's a good idea. Thanks. A cluster bomb is they're gravity delivered. Usually, let's talk about the Vietnam War, and so we'll put it in context. Because cluster bombs change over time, and let's talk about the ones that I primarily deal with in Vietnam and Laos. They're baseball-sized bombs that are delivered in large, what are called mother bomb set, which I think is a terrible name for them. And hundreds of these baseball-sized bombs are placed into these mother bombs and dropped from altitude over a target. When the mother bomb is dropped out of the plane, the fins spin it open, opens up like a giant clam, right? And all these baby bombs fall out. Now the baby bombs, bombies they call them, that are
or bomblets,
cluster bomblets, or sometimes called baby bombs. So people on the ground call them, and the cultures that have these as part of their culture, right? They call them bombies.
Bombies.
Right. And the bombies...
and a nice innocuous name for a dangerous object.
Right, yeah, exactly. Well,
almost like kids play.
It's almost, well, kids do play with them, and that's how we lose a lot of children to these things. But the bombies were, and still are, baseball-sized cluster submunitions that are a bomb inside of a bomb, right? So they have a fuse mechanism inside them that is based on spin timing and impact. So these things come out of the plane, they're supposed to spin enough in order to set off the fuse. The fuse then depends on impact. So if it bumps off a palm tree and into a rice paddy, or if it just has a glancing blow off of something, it's going to sit on the ground. Or if it just doesn't work. You know, how often do things not work? The failure rate on a cluster submunition.
That was my next question.
Yeah, and this is where the problem is. It can get up to 30%, 30% failure rate. So you can extrapolate from all the bombs dropped all over Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, all these cluster bombs. And have you ever seen when they show like carpet bombing of the Vietnam War? You see blam, 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 blam.
Yeah, that's nothing like. Okay.
That's when they talk about carpet bombing, they were talking about cluster submunitions, and they laid that stuff wall to wall. Man, that stuff was everywhere. We flattened central Vietnam with these things. Now with a failure rate of 30%, there are a couple million of them still on the ground, and they're really hard to find and expensive to remove.
Apparently, with a lifetime for decades.
Decades-long lifespan on these things, maybe 100 years, maybe even, because they're encased. There's such a tight little fuse in there, and they just have explosives in them. They last much longer than landmines will, and they'll be around much longer than you and I will. So when I was working on this project, the Missing Piece project, to try to tell some of this story, I came across this incredible newspaper article from St. Paul, Minnesota, where these divers had been hired to remove all these rusty cans, rusty barrels from the bottom of Lake Superior.
That they had just discovered, or
No,
someone
they'd been
knew
discovered.
what was in there?
Every now and then they find them because it's a Superfund site. There are parts of Lake Superior, the Superfund site. Chemicals are dropped there.
Sure.
We used to think we could dump things in the water and they disappear forever. And during the Vietnam War, the Honeywell Corporation was dumping stuff in the water, right? And so the divers knew, and people knew, that there were these big canisters on the bottom of Lake Superior, but they didn't know what was in them. And so the divers came out, they pulled these things on board their boat, they're leaking everywhere, they're rusty, and they found out that they pulled out 27 of these big barrels, and in 22 of the 27 barrels were cluster submunition fuses.
Goodness.
So these divers now suddenly have 22 barrels of fuses on their boat.
Which is a potential hazard, I would
Oh
imagine.
yeah, and it's
massive proportion.
Yeah, you don't know what it's going to do, and as explosives get older, they get more dangerous. They get more volatile. They'll explode as the TNT starts to break down. I don't know the science of it exactly, but they become more dangerous. God knows what can happen once it starts to get exposed to air after not being exposed to air for a long, long period of time. I don't know, but it became a very dangerous situation. Now, just like in the irony is what these divers discovered when they tried to get it off their boat was that they didn't have funding or permissions to bring them ashore, right? And nobody would let them bring them ashore or put them on a truck, haul them through
the garbage barges of New York. That's
right. They're floating around.
No one would take them.
No one would take it.
Not really a laughing matter, but
the irony is that just like in places all around the world, there wasn't the money or the permission to take care of these old cluster bombs that were dropped there by the Honeywell company that they produced weapons for the U.S. government for a long time. And so what the divers were forced to do, and these people on the boat were forced to do, was to get new barrels, package everything back up, and throw it all back in the water, where they sank down to the bottom of Lake Superior 50 years later. So the legacy of war, as I said in this, what you read on,
it's not only on foreign shores,
it stretches from the bottom of Lake Superior to the mountains of Southeast Asia.
And of course, you have a nice segue then, where you go into talking about a young boy, I believe it's in Vietnam.
Well, this happens every week.
Playing
right, and a couple months before they found these cluster submunitions that were bound for Southeast Asia at one point, a young boy, sadly, in Laos. He was 2 or 3 years old, had picked up a cluster bomb, and his family was eating around a fire, and they think he probably thought this cluster submunition was a potato of some sort or a fruit or something, and threw it in the fire. It's a baseball, it looks like this, and it's dirty, and it doesn't say bomb on it, and even if it did, this little boy wouldn't know what it was.
Rust and soil covered.
Right, so he threw it in the fire and sat down right in front of it. Nobody knew what he threw in the fire, and it exploded and killed this little boy immediately, and injured another 5-year-old girl, and 5 or 6 more people around the fire. That happens all the time, with disturbing regularity. And then a month later, 2 boys were killed in Vietnam, neighboring Vietnam, with a similar device to the one that the boy found in Laos and killed.
What would be your estimate of the number of munitions, submunitions? What's the correct term for unexploded ordnance in the ground
in Southeast Asia? Millions of tons of
millions of tons.
Tons, yeah, millions of pieces of this stuff that are.
But this is not just an issue in Southeast Asia.
No, Southeast
Asia.
Anywhere
where countries have used.
Yeah, anywhere where there have been landmines and lots of bombs. Now, Southeast Asia does have. Vietnam and Laos.
Thanks to U.S. policy, Robert McNamara.
It was a long time ago, and thanks to U.S. policy, this stuff is getting cleaned up too. But there were more bombs per capita dropped on Laos than any other country in the history of
Ho Chi Minh Trail, right? I believe.
Well, the Ho Chi Minh Trail cut through Laos and through Cambodia, and so the U.S. government, in attempts to disrupt that, bombed Laos and Cambodia, expanded the war. And as we know, had deadly effects on the region for a long time that stretched beyond the Vietnam War. But so in Laos now, for 10 years, it was 9 years, a plane load of bombs were dropped every 7 minutes. nonstop. Now, if you talk about Vietnam as well, and you're talking about people that for 10 years, that's all they knew.
Wait, say that again? A plane load of bombs?
A plane load of bombs. The equivalent of a plane load of bombs every 7 minutes dropped.
For what period of time?
For 9 years.
Goodness.
And that's what it works out to, just the amount
With
of
a
bombs.
30% failure rate, so you
So
do
they
the
talk
math
about,
and-
right, if you talk about an area the size of Vermont, and think about that, right, and think about all the bombs dropped, and Vermont and New Hampshire, let's take Vermont and New Hampshire and a few other states in New England, but just bombing the living heck out of New England for 10 years.
No place is safe.
Yeah, I mean, we bombed them during, when mothers are giving birth, we bombed them on their weddings, we bombed them on their funerals, and so these people were lived in that culture. But now, the reality is that this stuff is built to last, and we have a big job in cleaning it up.
Well, okay, so it seems that there's always various facets to what you're trying to do in the organizations that you're involved with. Mm-hmm. One is obviously removing the ordnance.
Yeah.
And two, I understand, is obviously providing support, relief, other humanitarian efforts to those that have been hurt or maimed directly. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it just so happens that a lot of the density happens to be in places where there's a lot of extreme poverty.
Right. Often, all too often, these sorts of conflicts occur in the poorest parts of the world. Central Vietnam is no exception. Now, clearance efforts for very poor people don't get a lot of effort, don't get a lot of funding. If there's not an economic reason to engage in a very expensive operation, it's usually not going to happen. Mm-hmm. What we did back in the mid-'90s in bringing attention to Central Vietnam, and let me say it, a lot of that came through Vermont.
And I'd like to touch on that a little bit.
And so what we did was we raised this as a humanitarian crisis in Vietnam. Thanks to Senator Patrick Leahy and the work of another Vermonter, Jody Williams, and working on the landmine issue. And the Freeman Foundation, which a number of your viewers may remember, the Freeman Foundation has had a lot of work in Vermont. Has done a lot of work in Vermont in education.
Freeman Foundation of Stowe, Vermont.
Of Stowe, Vermont, that's right. And they do stuff on NPR and VPR and all sorts of things. But they funded us in the millions of dollars in landmine and bomb removal in Vietnam. And they're all Vermonters.
But, I mean, I guess Vermont was kind of on the forefront of this directly due to efforts that you were involved in and some of the folks that you just mentioned.
Right. The front lines, it's interesting how
a small state making a big impact.
Well, small states have access to the same levers of power in the Senate that what we did have is we had someone very committed to the issue. Patrick Leahy has been, short of Princess Diana, he's probably had the biggest impact on landmine and bomb removal as an individual.
And why, I mean, it's not hard, I wouldn't question someone's commitment to these kind of efforts, but
why?
What specifically was it about Patrick Leahy? Was there some personal experiences
or
direct?
I think Vermonters as a whole have been. It's interesting to me because we had the Nobel laureate co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, Jody Williams, is a co-winner. A number of people won that Peace Prize with her. She was just the face of it. But a number of people in Vermont, from funding to politics to activism, were very involved in this issue. And I wonder if it's because we're from an agrarian state or because we have such a connection to the land that to feel feel certain, we feel more offended by the nature that by the idea that something in the ground could kill us.
Interesting.
Yeah. The landscape that we have here in Vermont is very similar to that in Vietnam. A lot of farmers, a lot of folks that I think we could maybe identify with. And the thought that just tilling your land could kill you, or your children finding a piece of ordnance. I think for some reason Vermonters really latched onto that issue, me being one of them. We've had a number of people from Vermont over in Vietnam working on this with us. So I don't know, maybe there's some sort of spiritual connection or some sort of sense of injustice about that. We have a very strong connection to the land here, and I think maybe that's what it is.
I like to think that Vermonters as a whole are fairly benevolent and generous in terms of being open-minded to the plight of others.
Right.
It's interesting that we're talking about this today because I believe very recently President Obama has made a commitment that the United States would join the...
He's made the commitment. He hasn't signed it yet.
He hasn't signed it yet. There's 161 nations that are currently signed on.
Yeah, I think it's 167 as of today, or something.
Including
like
Afghanistan. But I thought there was some interesting language in there, and I had to look at my notes, but it was something along the lines that it intends to join the Mine Ban Treaty in the future.
Yeah, well, that's a very wide open word.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah, and the future of the Obama administration is only a couple more years, if he's lucky at this point. So what does that mean? Well, I know that the United States has a lot more challenges in signing that treaty than others do. So I have some understanding of why it's complicated.
Right.
I think when we get involved in something like that, it's a lot different than it is for a country like
Switzerland.
Yeah, exactly. We have a lot of responsibilities everywhere. But at the same time, this is the dumbest weapon of war. The smartest military doesn't need it. The smartest military in the world doesn't need the dumbest weapon, right? We've proven that time and time again that we can work around certain things.
It's not considered a legitimate weapon, which I find is funny. There's this definition of there are in fact legitimate weapons out there, according to the Pentagon, which I think is another conversation. But
well, they're mainly defensive in nature, right? But what the U.S. government can do by signing this is what the U.S. government does by not signing it is they give cover to countries like Syria and China and to Russia. And Russia and Ukraine are already looking at, or you're already maybe even using landmines. So we can slip backwards. And I think it's very important for the U.S. government at this point to recognize that this is a weapon of the past. The smartest military in the world doesn't need the dumbest weapon, and we can work around it. Thanks to Patrick Leahy, who's been one of the few people to stay with us over the last 20 years. A lot of people have drifted off. We've lost a Princess. We've lost a Beatle. Paul McCartney isn't with us anymore, and even the Nobel folks have sort of moved on a little bit. I mean, they've moved on to other issues. So this is an issue that still needs that high power attention. And I'm grateful that he still brings it to the floor of the Senate. Let's see what Obama does. I'm hoping that they're good for that.
Do you have a read on its reception among House members and the rest of the Senate?
I think unfortunately, anytime in the current political climate that we have, anything that the president says is going to be, if he decides to do it or not to do it, he's going to find that
he's on the opposite end of.
Yeah, somebody's going to be upset, And as soon as there was a rumor that, as soon as the rumors were circulating that the administration was willing to sign the ban, already there were a number of people piling on with, this is a foolish move, or this is
anti-military or
anti-military. It's really not. The funny thing, it's not funny at all. Unexploded ordnance and landmines and all of that often get used as improvised explosive devices against our own guys. 5%, 5 to 10% of the deaths in Vietnam of our servicemen were
friendly fire.
No, they were actually repurposed bombs that were used against us, and creating their own landmines and such. So, getting failure rates down in bombs, removing these weapons that just lie around and wait, dealing with weapon stockpiles, those save the lives of soldiers, of U.S. soldiers. And I think the failure rates alone, if we could drop the failure rates alone on bombs and make that part, I'd love to see more of an effort put towards that. Just remove the failure rates and get them down to in serious levels. You're going to save U.S. soldiers' lives. Deal with stockpiles, get those out of there.
I think the whole scope of modern warfare is changing very rapidly now. With the use of drone technology and surgical strikes, and it does seem that we're kind of moving away from putting boots on the ground and putting our soldiers in harm's way. That said, you know, reevaluating how we should be using weapons, what kind of weapons we should be using. Just the whole concept is certainly, it just reminds us that we're in a challenging world today, in a world that has many hot zones, and whether we like it or not, we're being dragged back into the Middle East right now, and it's
well, I hope that we can keep his attention on that issue, get him to just do it, and I think I don't think our senator from Vermont is going to let him off the hook, so that's good, and then to keep funding, keep the funding stream open for efforts like.
Well, let me ask you, where does the funding come from currently?
Yeah. Here's the interesting thing. The U.S. government takes a ton of heat for not signing the landmine ban, for use of these weapons, but the U.S. government's the largest donor to landmine and bomb removal and victim assistance efforts.
Should they be obligated to be the largest donor?
Well, a number of us think so, and I think that's why the money's there. But also, it's not just an obligation. There are people. There are people inside the government that want to do the right thing, and there are people that have access to those decisions, those decision makers that know that we have the tools to remove these bombs. And personally, my opinion, I think that we have an obligation, a moral obligation, to clean up a lot. And I can already hear people say, and they said it to me for 20 years, so I can already respond. I know what it is. These folks should clean up after themselves and clean up their own countries. And really, these folks don't have the money. So if you want to talk about, if we can do the right thing by human beings and move away from they're not Americans or they're not us, we should help ourselves. These are kids that get hurt. These are kids that whose grandparents were children when these bombs were first dropped, or even their great-grandparents were still alive when the bombs were first dropped. It's a human issue. It's not a political issue.
Well, and of course, the United States is the largest provider of foreign aid to nations around the world.
Yeah.
What that foreign aid is directly attributed to, either, in some cases it's for weaponry, in the case of a number of nations, but a lot of times it's for humanitarian reasons. It's just another way to look at foreign aid, and improving the lifestyle of people by directly contributing aid for the removal of these weapons certainly should count in that.
I agree, and we have a situation in Southeast Asia. I just keep going back to Southeast Asia because that's where I cut my teeth and where most of my work was done, where we have large amounts of land that are unusable or at least dangerous. So, yeah, aid to these areas so they can become economically viable again after decades. That's a good investment.
I'm curious as to kind of like the the mechanics or the process or logistics of ordnance removal. How is that accomplished?
Well, that's a big question.
All sorts of technology.
There are so many different technologies and so many different scenarios and so many different landscapes to have that applied. Now, if you think about Vermont, if you think about the mountains, and if you think about flat cornfields, and then you think about different housing areas, you would use different technologies for each one of those situations, right? So for every situation, there's a different solution. The classic landmine, and let's just talk about landmines, is and other is set up lanes, and you go down the lanes and you pull them out. And there are, you can use dogs. Some people, they use rats. The sniffer rats. There are all sorts of technologies. The most reliable is the old-fashioned guy with a detector pulling them out of the ground. And we tend to think people that don't understand how areas become contaminated with bombs. They tend to think it's a really easy job. Why is this so expensive? And they come up with all these different kind of gadgets that'll help. And really, the landscape is so diverse in these areas that the best thing you have is an intelligent human being figuring out.
Or overgrown and.
Oh yeah, man! If you think about 40 years since bombs were dropped, these trees are there now that wrapped around bombs and all that. Now, what we're moving towards, to be more realistic in a lot of these places, is moving away from landmine and bomb free to impact free. So we're never going to get all the long after the memories of you and I have passed from the earth. You know, these bombs are going to be there. So so we have to make sure that these communities are impact-free, not necessarily bomb-free. Bomb-free is not realistic for Southeast Asia. It's not.
Okay,
so
define impact-free.
Well, impact-free means that they can have you can have large areas put aside that we understand could have enough. We're going to find zones to clear.
Risk has been mitigated to.
Risk is mitigated. You know, it's you're never going to pull this out. So what we're trying to do is there are studies, for example, we're just talking about landmines now. Studies about how long landmines actually do live. What is the real lifespan of a landmine? So we can determine how much money we can spend on certain areas. But in places like Vietnam and Laos, we're never going to get all the bombs. So how can we focus clearance on making it the least impactful on the human beings that have to live in this place, right? And how do we prioritize? An interesting story about the Falkland Islands.
Take me to the Falkland Islands.
Well, the Falkland Island penguin population is booming. They're really healthy, and they're not heavy enough to set off the landmines, right? So there are these basically penguin preserves now in the Falkland Islands.
But the coyotes, they're
no, nothing gets it. Nothing can, because the landmines protect them. There are forests that have come back to life because bombs are out there. Now, what if we just leave that stuff?
Is it from the Falkland Islands War?
No. Well, the Falkland Islands War, yes, where the landmines are.
That's when they're placed in the ground.
Right. But penguins are doing great because they don't set them off. They're safe. The predators don't come in. You know, it's a great spot. The human beings leave them alone. I mean, it's great. Penguins love it. So penguins, landmines have been good for the penguins, right? But there are parts of the world that maybe we don't have to clean up because we can't afford it. So let's focus on places where kids are going to grow up. Let's focus on places where we're going to have some form of industry, and let's make it impact-free, if not mine-free. There are some countries that they declare mine-free. What they really mean is these aren't going to hurt people anymore than where they are. We're good. We're pretty sure we've got a high degree of certainty, you know. But so that's the new goal. It's impact-free. Because if somebody says to you, what's it going to take to clear all the bombs out of Vietnam? Well, it's going to take a couple hundred years.
Yeah.
And it's going to take billions of dollars.
Resources.
Oh, right away you go, forget it. So instead, let's make something that's achievable. Let's get to a goal where we can say we're going to be impact-free for human beings in central Vietnam in 10 years. That's a reasonable goal. Impact-free in 10 years is a reasonable goal. Bomb-free? No, that's never going to happen. We drop too many of this stuff.
Now, what about you? What kind of cooperation did you receive from the local governments
in Vietnam?
Yes, and what's their part, if any?
Yeah. Well, when we started, let's talk about Vietnam again. When we started in Vietnam in the mid-90s, we were only 2 years after normalization of relations between our two countries. Right, 1995, Bill Clinton normalized relations between U.S. and Vietnam. So when we came in there, we were all wide-eyed. Everybody was wide-eyed, not sure what was going to happen and who's doing what. We used to have a minder that went with us everywhere we went from the government. They called him a translator, but we knew what he was doing, you know. And they kept an eye on us, and it was assigned to us, and all that. That sort of stuff doesn't happen anymore. What we did do is we brought a lot of resources into central Vietnam. You know, we brought a lot of money in to clear, millions of dollars at a time. We'd hire that means we'd hire local folks. We'd bring land back to be used again. We built a school. I
mean, and that's how are you received by some of these villages? You know, obviously there's probably some latent residual.
No, that's actually not true. And I have to say with complete honesty, that is not. I've never in 20 years going to Vietnam had an issue with that. One time, a mother that had just lost a child was very upset. But that wasn't even directed at the U.S. That was just directed at the world. And I have not, but you have to remember, we fought with half the country, right? So we were south of the DMZ, and we were fighting alongside the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese, we have very similar senses of humor, the Vietnamese and the Americans. We get along very well. Our cultures do somehow very well. We have a lot of fun. So people had positive memories of Americans individually. Now, if you talk about governments, I mean, that's a different story. You know, Robert McNamara, I think a lot of people would be the Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War.
Fog of War, fantastic documentary.
You know, a lot of proceeds from that went to my organization. But but they recognize the difference between individuals and governments. Many people do, or they've been at war with a lot of different countries. I've never run into any hostility. However, I also am, and I'm in the country. The context in which I'm there.
How many times have you been to Vietnam?
I don't know.
Wow.
I don't know. I'm not sure.
I mean, you've got some fairly impressive itineraries you've traveled on.
Oh man, I've been.
Interesting. Let's talk about Afghanistan. You had a trip to Kabul.
Oh, what an ill-fated trip that was. Well, I went to Afghanistan in February of 2012 in support of Clear Path International, which is an organization I co-founded in 2000 with a few friends of mine. Clear Path International started in Vietnam. We grew into Cambodia, to the Thai-Burma border, and once the war opened up in Afghanistan, the State Department asked CPI, Clear Path International, to work in Afghanistan. I haven't been working now with CPI for a few years. I haven't been in the management of CPI for a number of years now, but when I was when we founded it was pretty exciting. So in 2012, I had come back to CPI. That was my first time back, really, and I was going on a trip to escort Quill Lawrence of NPR.
No kidding.
Yeah, to different sites around Kabul that Clear Path International was engaged in, projects that we were engaged in. So, to my just my luck, I landed 2 days after all those Qurans were burned.
Right.
And riots were all through Afghanistan. 30 people were killed. The violence had just reached Kabul when I got there. So I landed at 6 o'clock in the morning. By noon, there was fighting right outside our compound.
I was going to say, was that visible to you? Was it audible to you? Was it?
Well, I'll tell you what was audible. The tension was almost unbearable. And when we were coming back from the airport road's a pretty dangerous road. We came into Kabul, and just it's obvious who we are. I mean, you have a white Land Cruiser, and it's obvious you're not from there, you know. And people were very upset, scowling at us and angry, and that was the beginning of the rioting in Kabul that lasted for a week, and I got there that morning. So I didn't, my trip to Afghanistan, a lot of it was spent locked in a room.
That was because I think they discovered the prisoners were communicating by
passing
back
Qurans
back and forth, and so U.S. soldiers burned them.
Qurans. Right. And there, you know, this sort of stuff gets us in trouble all the time. You know, this sort of easily avoidable cultural things that, well, it killed a number of people. It ruined, it further damaged the image of goodwill of the American people with these folks, or at least that willingness to understand them. And people died as a result of this easily avoidable situation.
Of course, here you are coming to the country to...
Well, I wound up Quill Lawrence and I wound up talking by phone. He wasn't allowed to leave his compound. I wasn't allowed to leave ours. We were on lockdown.
Oh, you were both in compounds?
Up maybe a mile away. Couldn't even see each other. And because the violence was so bad, I mean, we could hear gunfire.
How were you communicating? By satellite phone?
Oh, just by regular old phones and email. Probably Skype and email, probably.
Okay.
So I was in the safe room within hours of arriving in Kabul, and the safe room is in the basement, locked with a steel door and all that sort of stuff.
And U.S., what kind of protection?
We had just Afghans, hired Afghans. We didn't have any U.S. forces. Now we were just
never
down the
any
street.
issues of trust.
Well, you have that all the time. I mean, you're one layer away. But I love these guys. These folks that we worked with in Vietnam, in Afghanistan rather, were great guys. But you know, what do you know? You know, so who knows what's going to happen? But my experience was scary. But it was nothing to what, you know, folks go through every day of their lives over there. Or you know, not just our soldiers, but the people that live in Kabul. You know, a 12-year-old boy has to deal with bombs outside his house every day, and I'm like, You know,
Right.
a 40-something-year-old
Dropping
guy.
your son off to college, and those are your biggest concerns.
Right.
What's he going to get into next weekend?
Right, exactly, exactly.
No,
So to be in that situation, to have some form of understanding of, wow, this is unfixable, and you're in the middle of it, you know, it's eye-opening. But it was nothing compared to what people go through all the time. I had armed guards. I had a safe room. I had, you know, people that knew where I was if we needed to be taken out of there. But I mean, talk about folks that this is how they live every day. That's.
So how long were you on the ground for?
I was only there for a week.
Okay.
And I got out for 2 days out of that week into Kabul. Not even 2 full days. I mean, 1.5 days. So I went all the way around the world to sit in a room as big as this.
Oh,
You know?
so you didn't even leave it.
I couldn't. No, we couldn't go outside. It was
Because
too
of the-
dangerous. You could hear the yelling and the screaming and the gunfire and everything else. So we weren't allowed to leave. You know, everybody, all the expats and all the people living in the country were put on lockdown.
Now, Clear Path and some of these other NGOs and other organizations that are obviously devoted to this effort, are there resources on the ground now in these various countries, or is this something that's primarily run out of the United States right
Well,
now?
there depends on the country, it depends on the program, and it depends on the partner that the U.S. government chooses to implement the program. So there are, for example, in Vietnam, where ClearPath International started, we had started with a team of Vietnamese people, and it's an all Vietnamese-run organization in Vietnam. In Afghanistan, we had 3 Americans running the office, and then the rest of the staff were Afghan. And then in other countries, we would have maybe an office, and then implementing partners that were running programs. So it depends on the reality on the ground and what's culturally acceptable. Some of the organizations I work with, another one called the Polis Center for Social and Economic Development. Excuse me. That's probably spiked your sound levels. Sorry to the sound guy.
No.
So
We can edit that.
The Polis Center for Social and Economic Development, for example, to whom I consult on a pretty regular basis, they'll hire 1 or 2 people to implement programs, these wonderful, really slimmed down programs to aid amputees in certain areas, that kind of thing. So it depends on the organization, depends on what's needed.
Now, I understand you've been working with a well-recognized fellow who happens to call this area his home.
Are you talking about you?
Yeah, right.
So the most interesting man in the world.
Exactly.
Jonathan Goldsmith. Right. I have been working with Jonathan. And Jonathan, the Dos Equis guy, is famous from these Dos Equis commercials, you know.
I think I've seen 1 or 2 of those.
Oh, gosh. You know, the funny thing about meeting Jonathan is that for a long time, I liked his commercials anyway. And we met, Jonathan and I met after Hurricane Irene came through Vermont. And we were working together on a fundraiser for low-income Vermonters that may be waiting too long to get their aid from the government. So Jonathan and I, excuse me, can we edit this? I'm sorry.
That's
I hope
okay.
that's okay.
You're all right. Take a glass of water.
So Jonathan and I started working together on, after Hurricane Irene, put together a benefit concert, and we became very good friends after that night. We raised 20 grand one night at the Perfect Wife. What a cool night. I think you were there. Were you there?
I don't think I was there.
Oh, it was fun.
Oh, wait, was that?
With Ben Taylor and Sarah Lee Guthrie. And
No, I don't think I made it to
super
that
fun,
one.
super
I think I
fun.
was
Sarah
out
Lee
of
Guthrie and
town.
Johnny Irene and Ben Taylor. Super fun. Anyway, so
Boy, you just put me on the spot, too.
you were out of town doing something very important. So Jonathan and I got to know each other very well during that process. And I told him about this work I was doing in Vietnam, and it's like, wow, that sounds really pretty cool. And so fortunately, he was able to come to Vietnam last year with us. We blew up a bunch of bombs. My son shot a video for YouTube, which has now gotten 1 million hits on YouTube. And we raised a bunch of money. We've also are doing it again this September. Jonathan and I just got back from an Army base in Virginia, where we filmed a promo for Mines Advisory Group, which is another group that I consult for. And we shot a promotional video where Jonathan's blowing up bombs and talking about the issue in Cambodia. And so we're hoping to raise some money. And what we're doing with that is it's a contest, so people buy it's like a raffle to come to Vermont and hang out with Jonathan.
Oh,
Would
that's
that
fantastic.
Be fun? Would
That's
that be
great.
cool?
Well, I mean, that brings up an interesting point. I don't obviously have a large audience, but for those out there watching, and you know, for those who are taking interest in the subject matter, how can someone like myself or someone out there get involved? Where might they contribute? What's the best use of their resources? You know,
well, you know,
where would you
one of
steer
the things
them
for
towards?
Vermonters, one of the things that's important for Vermonters to do is to call their senator, call Senator Leahy and Senator Welch, and say that you appreciate the work that's being done. Senator Sanders, excuse me. And so call. And Congressman Welch, and call these folks and tell them you appreciate the work that's being done by the U.S. government at their insistence, right, at their urging, because no one in Vietnam is ever going to vote for these guys. No one in Afghanistan
Silent
is ever going to have
constituency.
right. No one in Afghanistan is ever going to have be able to say, hey, you know, we'd like so. So what these guys do, we have three great folks in Washington, Sanders, Leahy, and Welch are great. But just let them know that you appreciate that. And for Vermonters, that's important for us to do. We have access to these folks being in a small state that other people don't have. And just let them know you appreciate it and you hope they keep it up. That's really important. That's very important. And it seems so simple, and it doesn't seem like you could have much of an
Well,
impact.
it's funny. I think I do a fair amount of advocacy work on other issues in D.C., and I think there's this notion that at that level of government, these folks that represent us are so far removed that they're really inaccessible. But when you actually go down to D.C. and you walk through the Senate corridors, or
they're right there.
you know, you can walk right in the office. Half the time the member may be there, or half the time you're talking to a staffer. But you know, the accessibility is surprisingly available.
Well, respectful communication with these folks and let them know what was important to you. They work for you, you know, but at the same time they have a lot of different constituents to take care of. But that's an important piece. Of course, giving money to these organizations. Find one that that's working in a part of the world that you really want to have an impact in, and make a donation that way. That's important. It doesn't always have to be. You don't have to change the entire world to change the world a little bit, you know. And I think when you're able to donate directly and make sure that your funds are going to the right spot and be diligent about that, you can have a tremendous impact on a family for not much money. And that's what victim assistance programs do.
It's funny, I'm recalling when I was very little, it's kind of funny that we do overlap the Vietnam War era to some degree, maybe you a little bit more than I do, but I do recall back in the late 70s, just slightly, back in the late 70s, I recall my father helping to set up a couple of Vietnamese families in this town.
Wow.
Do you remember that?
I know that your father has done more than most.
Well, he, in conjunction with some other folks, actually.
Yeah, well, but your dad's actually been to Vietnam with my organization, and so your family's been great, but I don't remember that part. I don't remember that. I was pretty young.
It's just an old memory as we're talking about this stuff. I remember that you know, in my lifetime, that war was just coming to a close.
Well, it's unbelievable. Now it's been over for 45 years now, right? 40 years? What is it? 45 years. Yeah, 2000. It was, yeah. So if you think about that, 2015 will be 45 years since the actual end of the war, since the helicopters flying off the embassy, end of the war in 1975. Right, so that'll be 40 years.
40 years, yeah.
So 4 decades. Now think of all the wars in between that we've had, but 4 decades, we're still looking at bombs on the ground.
And so you, of course, this isn't the only effort that you're involved in. You've got a number of philanthropic, humanitarian organizations that you've been involved in, and they're obviously very fortunate to have you
well, I hope
contributing
they think so.
your time and your efforts. And
I'm working with a number of different things with my company, Hathaway Communications, and it's a one-man shop. And I'd like to think that what I help with is brand building efforts and establishing brand authority in issues of importance to these organizations. So on issues that are close to my heart and sometimes far from home, right? So that's what I hope to do. And so I worked with the Morris Animal Foundation. I've worked with on canine cancer efforts, which has been great. I've been working with the Polis Center for Social and Economic Development, which works in victim assistance in Central America as well as in Jordan with Syrian refugees. I've also worked with the Mines Advisory Group, which works in landmine and bomb removal. Worked with a great organization called Legacies of War. And Legacies of War is an advocacy group for funding for unexploded ordnance assistance, unexploded ordnance removal, and victim assistance efforts in Laos, which we were talking about before, the most heavily impacted per capita country in the world. And a few others, like Pure Water for the World out of Rutland, Vermont, which brings freshwater resources to Haiti and Central America. So I've been really lucky to be able to do things that I care about and that are exciting.
Well, I like that tagline, close to heart, far from home.
I got to use that. I just thought of it right here. I'm going to have to use it.
Well, I have to say the world's obviously incrementally a better place thanks to your efforts and the efforts of all those that have been involved.
I didn't talk about the bad stuff.
We didn't talk about the bad stuff, but maybe we'll save that for another time. You come back and spend another hour, but as is typical, these hours go by so quickly, and we never cover as nearly as much as we'd like to. But I appreciate you coming by.
Hour's up. We're already done?
Yeah.
This is like a between two ferns
We have
thing.
to leave some time for the little advertisements.
You do. You need 2 ferns so you can do the whole.
I thought about putting 2 ferns or
between 2 nerds. That's what this is.
Between 2 nerds. Yep. Whatever. We'll have to come up with something. But anyway,
this is great.
It's been great to have Jamie Hathaway here. I appreciate you spending one more hour with me. I'm Stephen Drunsic, your host of Q&A Live, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, buddy.
That was fun, man.
That was fun.